Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about Total War Pharaoh Dynasties, and to talk about some of the biggest problems that the game does have currently. To be clear, Dynasties is a significant improvement compared to the base game in terms of how it plays, in terms of how battles play in particular, the additions on the map, various other things that they have fixed or things they've added or improved upon. But there is still a lot of things CA Sofia could do. Now, whether or not CA will make that happen, will devote more resources or move on to other projects, we don't know. I think what Dynasties does show is that when a developer puts in the effort to fix a game, even one that was the worst launch in Total War history, that people will be very receptive to it. I guess we have to see what kind of decision will be made in Creative Assembly, but their plan before Dynasties came out is this is the last major update. They're just going to add hotfixes. But we will see what happens going forward. Now, starting with this list, I will actually start it with an honorable mention. And it actually has to do with chariots, one of the principal military units in the Bronze Age era. Chariots are pretty useless in Total War Pharaoh. One of the principal reasons is not that they lack combat ability or that their stats aren't great, though they actually don't have one of the main purposes chariots did serve during this era, which is transportation of units. Only ox carts have that capability, and that's only for the Peliset, for Walwetes. So most chariots don't have that capability. That is a problem. But in terms of their, charging capability, their combat capability in battles, the problem with chariots is that there's way too many models per unit. I mean, when Troy came out, chariots were very overpowered. They fixed that, but the problem is right now in Pharaoh, they're pretty useless. Too many models for a unit. You get pathfinding issues. If any of those models get stuck into a battle, they do end up hurting the entire unit. So reducing the models would be a solution, or something else they could do is allow us, and maybe this is something to do with all units, allow us to split off units in battle. That is something CA could do. Allow us to say, okay, I've got a unit of chariots here. Okay, let me split it up in 4 different units, 10 each, roughly. Let me split it up. That would actually make them far more useful in battle. So I'm going to talk about issues, and I'm going to talk about what I consider to be potential solutions to those issues. So that is an honorable mention. It is a problem, but there are bigger ones in the game as a whole. Now, one of the bigger problems, as far as I see it, has to do with the gods. The god system, ever since Troy, hasn't been particularly great. In some ways, the god system that we do have in Pharaoh is substantially better than what we had in Troy, where you had like Aphrodite being far better than anyone else. And of course, you had Minotaurs of Zeus and all that. But while the system is improved and you do have different choices you can go for, the simple fact of the matter is, it is annoying dealing with a system that requires you to build a huge number of structures, shrines, temples, all that. Also a system that requires you to constantly pray at shrines to get the benefit, and a system that feels limited. Like, on one hand, this is actually a fairly big problem. You do have limiting systems, like, you can only have 3 devoted generals, you can only have 3 gods, all that. But then you have this massive campaign map and a slower campaign pace overall inherently, with a lot of limitations in terms of economy, for instance, because you do have that, especially on default settings, but even with customizable campaign settings, it just kind of creates a bit of a mess. It is a big issue. But with the gods specifically, let's consider the Canaanite gods, just as an example, right? Like, I'm worshipping Moloch. He's actually pretty good. He gives you damage resistance versus missiles. He gives you a workforce growth from shrines. But other guards are not so useful. Influence is such a irrelevant system. It's so easy to increase your influence on default settings, customized settings, doesn't matter, that someone like Baal, completely freaking useless. The only thing that's useful for him is uncommon and celery chance. Replenishment, kind of useful, but you can handle replenishment in many different ways. But then you have so workforce growth is useful, damage resistance versus missiles is useful. Things like movement at sea and land, pretty damn powerful. But then again, things like happiness, not so great. Food benefit, 10% food increase from all buildings from a shrine. I mean, it can stack with multiple shrines, so it could be very powerful, but you get the idea. Some gods are significantly better than others, And it is an annoying system, especially because you have so many limitations. In some ways, I felt Troy handled this better because you could worship all of the gods in different ways, right? You could focus on one of them, get a lot of benefits with that. But typically speaking, in a campaign, you'd want to go with more of them. Sure, the problem was Aphrodite was too overpowered, but the way they've decided to limit things with devoted generals, with prayers, with shrines, with limits of god slots, that's ridiculous. It's like, what, did the Bronze Age Egyptians only worship one god or at one time or something like that? Sure, there was always a god for like a particular pharaoh that was like the supreme god, but all the others were worshipped as well. So I feel that the system of gods just doesn't work well. It pushes that imbalance even further. It's not quite as bad as how Aphrodite could be in Troy, but it's also not particularly great. So that's something of a carryover from the original intent of Pharaoh Dynasties, where you had like this very limited campaign map, and it isn't great. So that is number 5 on this list. And if that's number 5, oh boy, wait until we move up further, because we're just getting started over here. At number 4, we gotta talk about ancient legacies in the game. Like with many other systems, like the Power of the Crown, the Court, all that, there's a lot of slow-ass limited systems. But what's the problem with ancient legacies? Well, there's several issues with the way ancient legacies work. One, I feel the system of ancient legacies would be substantially better if we could go for multiple ancient legacies at the same time. Sure, don't have them all unlocked from the start, but it would be such a better system inherently if we could, we start with an ancient legacy, then we can pursue a second one, a third one, whatever limit you want to put, but allow us to go for more of them. Sure, it would give the player a lot of power, but let me tell you this, the campaign dynamic can be pretty boring at times, especially with certain ancient legacies that are powerful, but you don't necessarily have something to do. But here's the thing, that's one issue, the limitation of only having one ancient legacy. But the second issue, far bigger issue in a lot of ways, some ancient legacies are significantly better than others. As an example, the Benevolent, best ancient legacy in Hati, far better than Overseer. Overseer is useless. Sargon the Great versus the Lawmaker, well, I might have to do a follow-up video on the Lawmaker compared to the one I did before, because I got some things wrong. Both of them are pretty solid, but I think like Sargon the Great wins out very easily. The Aegean situation is actually a bit better, because on one hand, you do get domination. On the other hand, with Perseus, you get various recruitment from allies and vassals, as well as being able to improve diplomacy with various factions. Though, I gotta say, the cooldown on some of these things is not great. And I gotta say this, some of these things are so slow that even if they're really strong, like, yeah, improve diplomacy, but the cooldown of the damn thing with Perseus is so long that you're not gonna use it necessarily a whole damn much. Then we look at Egyptian legacies. Consider this. Well, basically, we'll talk about the merchant in a bit, but in essence, with the ancient legacies of Egypt, effectively, the merchant is the best by far, and then you have a 10. The builder and the conqueror, flat out useless legacies. The builder, build ancient monuments that are really powerful. Yeah, they're freaking crap. Like, consider this, you have to spend a lot of resources. What are you getting? Some happiness, some diplomatic relations, some victory points, a very paltry amount of victory points. And you have to build in this particular settlements. Ooh, 20% food. Great, and influence. So yeah, some of these ancient legacies are completely useless. Some of them are really good and work well. Like Sargon works well. A 10 can work well, as an example. Perseus and Atreus, kind of mixed feelings on that. On one hand, they can give you some real tangible benefits, but they are also the kind of things like with Atreus, it's kind of bugged with the rewards apparently, and having to raid an enemy territory is annoying. With Perseus, it works, but yeah, you get the fun factor of being able to recruit a wide variety of units, which is fun, and improving diplomacy and factions, but it's kind of dull as well. Like, that's another thing. Some are powerful, but they're not particularly interesting systems to engage in. Others are a bit more interesting, like Sargon is a bit more interesting. And even the Lawmaker, like Mesopotamia is probably the best campaign area of the game right now. Others are more interesting to deal with, but you can only have one. So those are some of the issues with ancient legacies. But we're not done yet with ancient legacies, because yes, Overall, ancient legacies are a problem, but there is one ancient legacy that stands above all others in creating a problem. Because at number 3, we have the Merchant. Now, the Merchant isn't a broken ancient legacy. It's not bad. It's not horribly designed. In fact, it is very well designed. It is so well designed, in point of fact, I will dare argue that it should be a baseline mechanic that everyone should have access to. Or you can choose to have access to it, at the very least. Here's the problem with the Merchant. It is so much more powerful than anything else. It's easy to use. It's profitable from turn 1 of your campaign if you allow features enabled. And if you allow all ancient legacies, regardless of course, it is going to be available in every single campaign. And it is exceptionally strong. How strong? So strong that you spend a lot of money sending caravans to a region. You get there in 1 turn, you return back in a turn, and you're making more money than you spent, relatively speaking. Because even if, say, I spend 4,000 food, I send it to the Western Desert, I'll come back with 1,200 stone. I'll come back with 400, 600 bronze, and other benefits as well. And it's not just raw money. It's worth pointing this out. It isn't just raw money that is on offer over here. You get things like reducing attrition damage, workforce growth. If we look at some other things over here, upkeep size, gold recruitment cost, gold recruitment upkeep that are available. And those are just some of the options. Replenishment, influence, XP per turn. You don't necessarily have the same combat benefits, right? But you can get some combat benefits as well. Kushite bronze weapons, melee damage, break-free charges, for instance, as an example. Dependent on where you're sending a caravan. Siege holdout time. There's not obviously as many combat benefits in its items that are available, but the power is there over here for items. It's not just a case of like, oh, you're just getting money. No, you're getting a lot of things. Workforce growth, influence, happiness, some combat capabilities, some upkeep benefits, all that kind of stuff. Like if I'm looking at what is available here, it is freaking significant. It is not hilarious. If you're playing any other ancient legacy in the game, you're nerfed. And this is very significant. You will gain more money. You will gain so much money from this. You will literally not need an economy. This is not hilarious. You will not have to bother with any economic building. It can be a bit tricky early on, but once you get the boat rolling, you're not stopping. You know, some people complain about like, oh, you're using customized campaigns. Let me tell you something about the customized campaign settings I use. I play in a nerfed way, especially in Egyptian campaigns, because I'm not playing with the Merchant. I choose not to play with the Merchant because I would rather experience, the variety of ancient legacies. But this is too damn freaking powerful, right? Melee attack, powerful strikes, that kind of stuff. Or we go into a SUA, influence, happiness, recruitment cost, more happiness, other things as well. This is ridiculous. But you might not get the most powerful armies, sure. As, say, something like a 10 can give you as an example. But here's the important bit about this. Would you rather have one powerful army or 10 armies? Because that's how powerful the Merchant is. There's so much power you gain from it. It is not even hilarious. It makes it so that you can play any campaign, any character, minor factions, major factions, it doesn't matter. Now, maybe it should be nerfed. Possibly. Maybe longer distances, whatever. But here's what I would say. I feel this system should be a baseline in every campaign, and everything else, every other ancient legacy should be a choice. Like, you should have multiple ancient legacies, but the Merchant, the caravan system should be default. Maybe it would benefit from having longer distances, but not be useless like the Cafean caravans. Cast-Dwarf caravans a bit more useful, but even those become useless. So this system is very useful, very powerful. I don't begrudge it for that, but I think like maybe they should take a page from that and actually have the caravans on the map. And maybe at least make some of the locations last at least 2 turns, something like that. It would still be incredibly powerful. Though I would rather not have like 14 turns to get to a Suo or 16 turns to get to Phrase, because already Sending a caravan that far away is a significant nerf. That's kind of another problem with the merchant. You have all these choices supposedly, but in reality you're only really trading with territory next to you. Because one turn going, one turn back is incredibly powerful, as opposed to, having to wait 8 turns to get to a location, then 8 turns to get back. That is not great. Maybe there should be a penalty if you're trading with the same location over and over again. That is something that Warhammer 3 does. You can't just send one caravan after another in the same location. So some penalty with a cooldown timer for like 5 turns per location could be useful. Give you a reason to go for other locations. But I feel it should be a baseline game mechanic, not an ancient legacy. And number 2, it is related to armor. And specifically how useless light infantry units or light units are compared to heavier units. CA Sofia had this idea in mind, like, we're going to have lighter infantry units, but they're going to move faster, they're going to do better in different types of terrain. It ended up being complete bullshit. And it still is complete bullshit. Like, look at this situation right here in this particular battle. We have an army in forced march under Meneptah, or Meneptah's general. He's a level 3 general versus level 10 Ramses. I have a bunch of tier 3 and even tier 4 units over here in this army, with a couple of tier 2 units, but the vast majority of these guys are much higher tier. I vastly outnumber him, and yet because a lot of my units have very low armor, the auto-resolve is about even. I would win this battle, don't get me wrong, and if I auto-resolve this, but it would be ridiculous. Now granted, part of the reason they have such a good situation in auto-resolve is because they have highly experienced units, much higher experience than my guys. But still, it's ridiculous. There's no way this particular army comes even close to winning this battle. They would just get obliterated. That's simply the fact of it. But it is a problem. It does affect Ramesses and Seti far more than others, but overall it does affect the overall balance of the game. Because when auto-resolve favors heavier units, that affects how the AI behaves against one another. Another problem with all of this is that due to the way the AI is scripted right now, they're going to recruit a bunch of lower tier units as opposed to recruiting higher tier units for the sake of their armies. Like if we look over here at this particular army, right, you're just seeing an army of Ascalon of just tier 1 units. Now granted, this is because Ascalon fell, the Palisade took it, I had to retake it or rebuild it in the process of doing so. But still, you get the notion of how these kind of things do play out. It is a ridiculous imbalanced situation. And again, unit recruitment is such of nature that basically it forces you as a player, if you're playing any campaign, to try and recruit higher tier units that have better armor in every situation, because you will do better. So every resource that you have in a campaign is spent on that. It's useless to recruit low tier units in a campaign because they just won't do well. And even ignoring the auto-resolve problem, they will take significantly higher casualties in battle. This is a bit ridiculous. I understand armor is supposed to be important, but when you make low armored units useless, but at the same time have roughly the same cost for all of them, you're not creating a well-balanced situation in a campaign. Because, for instance, Ramesses' armies over here, they're significantly more expensive than this one. Like, this one, it would be a very, very cheap army. My guys are costing me a bunch of bronze, they're costing me a bunch of food, and this is with campaign customization that reduces the cost by quite a significant amount. If we look at the general, if I were to recruit the general, over here we can see that each of these Magi Chargers cost me 200 bronze to recruit. Each of the swordsmen and archers over 100. The only ones that are good are the Sheridan Raiders because they have a decent level of armor, but skirmishers are specialized units that you only use in a certain context. In point of fact, I would actually be much better off recruiting a bunch of Shasu warriors in this campaign as opposed to any of the Magi Chargers or Magi units. So it can make entire faction rosters useless, it can make entire native unit rosters useless, it creates a significant imbalance. Now, I think they've moved in a far better direction with lethality. It certainly evens the odds. It's making all kinds of units far more useful than it was before. but part of the problem still remains. To be clear, Ramesses is the major exception. He is not the rule. Every other campaign, including SETI, for all the problems SETI does have in his campaign, every other campaign does handle much better in this respect. But the inherent problem still exists, even if it is largely consigned to the AI, because you as a player can deal with it. But dealing with it means rushing for tier 3 recruitment, at least. Means spending all of your early game gold on instant construction to recruit units that are worth it, as opposed to bothering with any lower tier units. It is not necessarily a great campaign dynamic, and at the core of it is this particular issue. So very significant. They've moved on the right track with it. Far less of a problem than before. They've rebalanced a bunch of things. Still less of an issue, but Ramesses' quote-unquote elite army, it's still a pile of garbage in a lot of ways. For all the benefits Ramesses does have in his campaign, mind you. Finally, and number one, it is the overall economy. Now, don't get me wrong. The system of resources that we have in Pharaoh, which was taken for Troy, is great. Having to manage different kinds of resources is a great idea in theory. But in practice, it's always been a system that needed an update ever since Troy, and the way they decided to improve quote-unquote things in Pharaoh wasn't necessarily in the best possible direction. To explain why that is, in Troy, it was very possible in a lot of campaigns to have a huge stockpile of resources that you then had to spend. But how you spent them, that was the big question mark. Like, what were you focusing on? Now, granted, Troy had a lot of issues, still has a lot of issues, and certainly has the same issue of, like, you want to get higher tier units as quickly as possible. But the thing is, you had a lot of resources, and you had to be strategic in spending them. Pharaoh, on the other hand, because it was designed to be a limited, slow-ass game, doesn't have significant resources. So, you end up in a lot of situations where you just generate very, very little food. And even very basic units in a campaign, if we look at, say, I recruit a general over here, even some very basic units still are things like, you look at these guys, there's still 200 food to recruit. That is an entire structure worth of food spent on this. Now you can say the same about Warhammer 3, but in Warhammer 3, you can maintain a lot of armies. Now, granted, this campaign is turn 11, but this is an issue that's going to stay throughout the course of your entire campaign. It feels meaningless in a lot of ways to focus on resource production from settlements because you're never going to have all that you need. What this leads to is so many problems in every other aspect in the game. For starters, very significantly, it affects AI. One of the reasons the AI recruits hot garbage is because they don't have the resources to recruit anything else. Troy did this better because Troy had inherent income on various things. Granted, you had to research it, but it was very basic, fast research that everyone could get. So it was not a problem there. Here, it is a significant problem because you don't have an inherent income of resources, so you're having to constantly do the freaking following. You're having to go every turn and say, okay, let's say I have, 900 wood, right? I don't need it right now. I've done all my construction. So ignoring the fact that I have extra diplomacy over here, but I need, more food, okay? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to trade that 500 wood for say, 2,000 food from the AI. Funnily enough, and I'll get into this, funnily enough, the only resource the AI actually has in plenty amounts and gets a significant income from is freaking food. Right? Like, look at this. This guy is sitting as 30,000 freaking food. He's not spending it. But then if we look at bronze, if we look at other things, they have barely any in every other resource. That is frankly ridiculous. It was a problem in Troy already. But at least there you balanced it out, so the AI was able to keep up with it. Here, you're not able to keep up with it unless you're doing this constantly. One of the reasons I use DLA evaluation and lower upkeep in my campaigns is because at least I can get away with doing this less. You can say it trivializes the campaign, but frankly, what I would do otherwise is just every turn, trade, and it's not fun. It's repetitive, it's boring, it's dull. It's not a great system. But you have to do it. If you don't engage in the system, either with basic diplomacy or cheesing diplomacy, or even worse, forget like the trade of resource. Let me tell you what you do actually do. You take freaking regions that you don't need in a freaking campaign, and it's like, oh, give me all you got, right? Or give me a significant number of resources, and you end up in the same mess of a situation that you may have in say, Warhammer 3, where one of the best things to do in a campaign, because you want money, you want resources, you want diplomatic relations, is to just take settlements that, the AI wants, keep in mind the 20 benefit to diplomatic relations, and just get everything that you need, right, from the AI. That's how you maintain yourself. This is a cheap, cheesy, crappy campaign system. You overcome it, it's easy enough to do, but it is annoying to deal with constantly. It hurts you, it hurts the AI. It's worsened by the fact that, as I said, unlike Troy, we don't have inherent resources. But on top of that, administrative costs, administrative tiers are going to hurt you even further. It gets to the point where you realize as a player, you don't want to bother with food production. You just, because the AI gets a lot of food, the only thing that they get in vast quantities, you focus on everything else and you trade surplus stone and wood, in particular gold, if you have it, for food and bronze. But there's never enough bronze. Any unit that's worth recruiting will require bronze in a campaign. Every single unit. And it's not small quantities either. This gets to the point of ridiculousness. I appreciate the system, but I feel it should be more generous with resources. And keep in mind, this is with lower upkeep and significant diplomatic benefits to ease this out. This is one of the reasons the merchant is so broken, because the merchant literally will generate more resources in a single turn than a massive global spanning empire can possibly do so. If you have enough resources, like you could control dozens of regions, and you would generate more in one turn with the merchant than you would for your empire. That is broken. That is inherently broken. This is one of the big disappointments I had with Pharaoh at launch. It is a launch issue, not the Dynasties issue. Again, they've improved a lot of things with Dynasties, but the difference here is in Troy, you could genuinely get away, like if you had one gold mine, a single gold mine was such a power play. A single gold mine was so significant in your campaign that you wouldn't need to do this. Or if you did do it, you certainly weren't doing this much. A couple bronze mines, all that. Here you can have entire provinces producing bronze and food and gold and all that, and you don't really feel it. And the problem this creates is like building a massive global empire is slow, tedious, annoying. Again, campaign customization is a thing. I'm sure there's mods already, Radius and all that. If Radius hadn't nerfed lethality into the ground, I probably would play with it more, but still an issue. And I think the key takeaway I would give over here, slowing the pace of the campaign is a really bad idea in a limited campaign. Especially when you have other systems that don't mesh well with the long campaign. Because there's a lot of things in Pharaoh that don't work very well on a long campaign as well. But the intent is like, oh, we're going to play a campaign very slowly, all that. But you don't even have the resources from a single province to maintain a full army of troops properly. Pretty broken. So, and nor does AI, except for food. That's why you get a lot of these crappy armies that AI does have in a campaign. Or occasionally you get higher tier units, though I think those Thracian Light chariots might not be that expensive, but like, yeah, they have a bunch of crappy stuff over here in this campaign. So problems galore. Improvements have been made in Dynasties. They're on the right track, but there's more to be done. Costin signing out.